This is a review of the Pacific Theater of World War II. We started talking about in class how the Japanese early in the 1930s caused alarm in the Pacific by essentially invading Manchuria, a northern province here from China. And we talked about the fact that the United States refused to recognize Japanese imperial aggression in the Pacific Rim and tried to impose an embargo or stop trading oil and steel with Japan in order to slow their imperial ambitions down. And essentially this is what caused the rising of tensions in the 1930s between the United States and the Japanese Empire. There was a high alert that was put out in the Pacific to be aware, and we were kind of thinking that Japan was going to target the Philippines or Guam, U.S. possessions in the Pacific. But of course, what Japan attacked on December 7th, 1941, what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said was a date which will live in infamy, was of course Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was the main base for the American Pacific Fleet, and Japan hoped by making a surprise attack on December 7th, 1941, that it would force America to recognize Japanese predominance in the Pacific. Because at the same time they hit Pearl Harbor, they made a general sweep of land acquisitions in the lower Southeast Asian and Pacific Rim. Of course, what happened in reality is that America did not simply roll over and recognize Japanese predominance. Instead, as we learned, December 7th, 1941 becomes the event, the attack on Pearl Harbor becomes the reason why America declares war on Japan and in essence on the Axis powers, including Germany and Italy as well. And so we will fight to regain and liberate these areas that have been taken over by the Japanese following Pearl Harbor. One of the early gains that the Japanese had made following Pearl Harbor was in the Philippines. This, of course, was an American base, as was Guam, related to our victory in the Spanish-American War way back in 1898. And American General Douglas MacArthur fought for 3 months. American troops and Filipinos fought against Japanese conquest, but because we were preoccupied in Europe at the same time, this did not end up with a victory early in 1942. So MacArthur retreats to Australia, vowing that he shall return, which he will. We'll see. From April to May of that year, 1942, the thousands of Filipino and American prisoners of war were forced on a POW march. The Japanese took them over 60 miles in the blazing sun to a prisoner of war camp in the interior of the Philippines from Bataan. And this, of course, was done partly because of a lack of resources on the Japanese part, but partly because of their Japanese code of military conduct. They did not respect people who surrendered as equals, and they treated POWs very savagely. This was a violation of the Geneva Convention we talked about, which was an international convention on how prisoners of war should be treated humanely, given water, food, basic provisions. But the Japanese violated this with the mistreatment in the Bataan Death March, and it generally reflected the savagery of the fighting in the Pacific, as reflected in the military culture of Japan. Japan will not surrender. They don't believe surrendering was the honorable thing to do, and will instead fight to the death. So the fighting in the Pacific becomes quite savage through the war. By April, there was the Doolittle raid that we talked about. The U.S. will avenge Pearl Harbor by striking Tokyo directly. This is not necessarily a turning point, but it does expose Japan as vulnerable to attack, and it sends a message, and it certainly was a morale boost for America to learn that Japan was hit following Pearl Harbor. The turning point turns out to be the Battle of Midway. These are the Midway Islands, and essentially Japan had hoped to draw America's Pacific Fleet once again out in the Pacific for one final battle. And they sent a large number of Japanese ships, torpedo ships, aircraft carriers, and they had also sent a diversionary attack team to the north. But we had essentially received their naval codes, interpreted them, and knew that they were on their way and knew what to expect. So even though we were outnumbered, this battle becomes a major Allied victory. It's called the Miracle at Midway because, again, we were pretty overwhelmed in terms of numbers, but being able to decipher their codes and detect them on radar helped us win the day. And this will be the last threat that the Japanese will make to the Hawaiian Islands, and it will be the turning point in the Pacific theater as we start making more of an island hopping campaign following Midway. In terms of naval code, just remember we had talked about the Navajo. Unlike the Japanese, which we were able to decipher their codes, the Japanese had a hard time deciphering what we were communicating because we used the Navajo code talkers. The Navajo language is a verbal language, it's not a written language, so this type of communication was impossible for the Japanese to interpret and kept our messages quite secret. Just keep in mind the Nisei were Japanese Americans who had served with distinction in the war. We talked about the Tuskegee Airmen, African Americans who served with distinction. Mexican Americans also served with distinction during World War II, albeit in integrated units when compared to African Americans who served in segregated units. So including the Navajo, the Nisei, the African Americans, Mexican Americans, many minority groups who otherwise were not necessarily given full civil rights through this time in the United States did serve with distinction and found ways to prove their loyalty and used their service in World War II to help push for greater civil rights at home after the war. From the fall of 1943, following Midway all the way to the end of World War II, we followed a policy of island hopping. This essentially means that we're going to seize islands closer and closer to Japan, using them as bases for air attacks eventually that we plan to make on Japan itself. We're going to cut off supplies through submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. So quite fierce fighting in the island hopping campaigns. Eventually in this island hopping we do take back the Philippines. We talked about General MacArthur early in the war having to abandon the Philippines. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, quite large naval battle, kamikaze suicide pilots, Japanese pilots will bomb with their aircraft, U.S. aircraft carriers, and it just showed how fierce the fighting and the defense of Japan would be as we got closer in our island hopping campaign. By the end of 1944, we had taken the Philippines, and MacArthur, shown quite famously in this photograph, walking through the surf, keeping his promise to return. In the end, we talked about these two little small islands of Okinawa and Iwo Jima became kind of the last significant hop on our way to Japan in the island hopping campaign. These two islands, albeit small, were very heavily defended by the Japanese. There were thousands of Americans who died in taking these islands, and even more Japanese who, as we said before, would rather fight to the death than surrender. So we understood as we got closer to Japan the sacrifice that was going to take place as the contemplation of a land invasion was on the minds of policymakers. we tried to force Japan to surrender, illustrating the futility of continuation of fighting by bombing Tokyo round the clock. Japan did not surrender. So we started to talk about this atomic bomb project, which had actually been started during the time that FDR was still alive, had first been initiated to be used possibly against the Germans. Albert Einstein had written a letter to President Roosevelt warning that the Nazis were developing an atomic bomb and that we probably should want to start developing one. But of course the war in Europe ended before the war in the Pacific theater did. And so when FDR died, President Truman was told about this bomb project. And Truman decides to drop 2 bombs over 2 Japanese industrial cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One is a uranium bomb, the other one was a plutonium bomb. And as we said, this becomes a very controversial decision, partly because of the arms race that it produces with the Soviet Union after the war, partly because the tremendous loss of life and just the nature of the bomb itself. Whether or not it should have been used continues to be a matter of debate. But as far as World War II is concerned, President Harry Truman made the decision to drop the atomic bombs to end World War II because of the terrible prospect of casualties involved in a land invasion of Japan. He felt like dropping the atomic bombs was the only way to force Japan to surrender. It would bring a quick end to the war with the least amount of casualties. So Japan will surrender on September the 2nd, 1945. This will be, of course, called VJ Day. We'll be talking about the atom bomb a lot in our next unit. We'll talk about the arms race with the Soviet Union and, of course, the ever-presence in the Cold War fear of another atom bomb. So with that, please review the slides. This concludes the World War II material.